Mr. President, for months now, I've been coming down to the floor to talk about an issue that I know the American people want us to talk about, and that's the economy, and that's the importance of growing our economy. And I've been highlighting what, unfortunately, has been a very anemic record of economic growth over the last 10 years, highlighting what's called the gross domestic product for the United States. Now, I've been doing that, Mr. President, because certainly the Obama administration doesn't want to do that. When we look at these numbers, we know that these are some of the weakest economic numbers, certainly in the last 70 years. Some of the most weakest economic numbers in U.S. history. And the media doesn't want to talk about it. So I believe it's important that we come and have a debate on the economy because the American people want us to talk about this. I want to remind my colleagues that the gross domestic product, what we have here on this chart, is really a marker of the health of our economy. It's really a marker of progress, a marker of the American dream. And right now, we have a sick economy, by any measure. Last quarter, the U.S. economy grew at 0.8% GDP growth. Barely grew. Put that in perspective, Mr. President. What's made our country great, year after year, decade after decade, has been an economic growth rate of about 3.7%, almost 4%. If you look at this chart, it has many different administrations. This headline here is the 3% GDP marker, which is considered okay, not great. Usually most administrations are above that. But year after year, decade after decade, Democratic administration, Republican administration, what's made the country great is economic growth. And if you look at the Obama years, right here, never even hit 3% GDP growth. Now, that's why they don't want to talk about it. When the president does talk about it, he doesn't remind Americans that this is the slowest, weakest recovery in over 70 years. But when he does talk about it, he still points fingers at those who came before him. But after nearly 7.5 years, 2 terms, this economy is his. He owns it, and he should take responsibility for it. As Michael Boskin, the well-respected Stanford economics professor, put it, quote, Mr. Obama will likely go down as having the worst economic record of growth of any president since the trough of the Great Depression in 1933, unquote. And whether or not the president owns up to it, there is no doubt, just look at the charts. These are their numbers, by the way. These are the Obama administration numbers, that we have experienced a lost decade of growth that is really, really harming not only the economic security of our country, the national security of our country, but most importantly, American families who are experiencing this. The great engine of our economic growth, driven by the American worker, the most productive worker in world history, is now idled because we can't grow our economy. And Mr. President, we had more evidence of this last month with the abysmal May jobs report. Now again, nobody talked about it. Media didn't talk about it. Certainly the White House didn't talk about it. But we should be talking about it. What happened in May? The report showed that in May, employers throughout the entire United States added 38,000 jobs. 38,000 jobs. That's in an $18 trillion economy that employs 126 million Americans. 38,000 jobs is nothing. And everybody knows it. As a matter of fact, the Fed chairman, Janet Yellen, today talked about what a dismal report that was in May. In fact, that's the lowest monthly gain since 2010 in terms of jobs. In 2016, this year has seen the worst employment start since 2009, since the beginning of the Obama administration. All of this is very bad news for the country, for the economy, and American families and American workers. Every economist, including the Fed chairman today, every pundit, even politicians who understand this issue know that this is a big problem. And yet the president and members of his administration refuse to level with the American people about what's going on. You didn't hear anyone talking about the jobs report. In fact, they're calling our economy the strongest in the world right now. And they're touting the fact that despite this economic jobs report, the unemployment rate actually ticked down. It went down from 5.1% to 4.7%. So they're kind of bragging about that. That's normally good news. Unemployment rate going from 5.1% to 4.7%. They're talking that up. So what's going on here, Mr. President? What's really the story behind the numbers? Because the people who know these numbers know what's going on. So I thought I would try to explain a little bit of why this administration is not leveling with the American people at all. First, having the strongest economy in the world right now is nothing to brag about. The president used to brag about how we're growing more than Europe. That was last quarter. We're not growing more than Europe now. EU grew at about 2% GDP growth last quarter. We grew at, like I said, 0.8%. So even that comparison is not working. And an economist recently stated that bragging about having a strong economy right now globally is, quote, like having the best looking horse in the glue factory. Not a lot to brag about there. But really, Mr. President, the only comparison that matters when the administration tries to spin, hey, we're doing better than Japan or better than Brazil, the only comparison that matters is this one. How are we doing relative to American history? That's all that really matters, not the spin of how we're doing relative to another country. This is what matters. And again, by any measure, we're performing very, very poorly for the last 10 years. Second, let's unpack the unemployment numbers. The 4.7% unemployment rate sounds pretty good. But what the president knows and what his administration knows but won't tell the American people is that that rate from the jobs report last year had numbers behind it that were very, very worrisome. If we only created 38,000 jobs, then how does the unemployment rate go down from 5.1 to 4.7%? Well, here's how. The standard measure of unemployment in this country, the unemployment rate, includes only people who are actively looking for work. That's a term called the labor force participation rate. So if the labor force participation rate goes down, then the unemployment rate will also go down, even if we have a weak economy. So what happened in May? Why did the unemployment rate tick down to 4.7%? That's normally good news. Well, we know it's not because of robust job growth, because there was only 38,000 jobs created. Nobody thinks that's robust. What happened in May, and the White House isn't talking about it, the unemployment rate went down because almost 700,000 American workers quit looking for a job. Think about that, Mr. President. In 1 month, 664,000 Americans. In 1 month, almost 700,000 Americans who have been looking for work. They got discouraged. They said, there's nothing out there. This economy is so weak, so I'm quitting even looking for a job. That's why the unemployment rate went down. Not a strong economy, not strong growth, discouraged American workers saying, I'm done. I'm not even going to look anymore. And of course, Mr. President, that is nothing to celebrate. 700,000 Americans completely discouraged and said, I've had enough. I'm not even going to try. Think about the families. Think about the workers who made that decision. Unfortunately, this is one of the dismal economic legacies of the Obama years. Year after year, as exhibited by this chart, millions of Americans have simply left the workforce. They just quit. This is a chart of the labor force participation rate at the beginning of the Obama administration and now. And you can see, Mr. President, year after year, more Americans just say, I've had it. I give up. The economy's too weak. I'm quitting. Quitting even looking. And again, they're not counted in the unemployment rate. Now, the labor force participation rate is a rather ungainly term. But what it really measures is the hope of the American worker and his or her family. So we should call it the American Worker Hope Index. Here's the Hope Index for the American worker. And as you can see by the chart, it has been crashing year after year under this president with his economic policies. Hope has been declining for American workers ever since the president got into office. In fact, it has not been this low since the economic malaise years of President Jimmy Carter. If you see the right hand here, 62%, the Carter malaise years, Clinton, Reagan, Clinton, Bush, and then the Obama years. Back almost on par with the Carter years. That is not a strong legacy. The last time we had an American Worker Hope Index this low was in 1978, the height of the Carter stagflation, when so many Americans were discouraged from even trying to work. And that's the legacy that we have right now. So, Mr. President, the most recent jobs numbers that came out in May was the day that the president gave a speech to a bunch of high school students. And to the children, the high school kids, the president painted a rosy picture of the economy. He told them that the economy was strong and that he had cut the unemployment rate in half. Now, we know that that's not a fully accurate statement. If we had the same labor force participation rate today that we had at the beginning of the Obama administration, our unemployment rate would actually be 9.7%, almost unchanged from the beginning of 2009, when it was 10.1%. So bottom line, the main reason, indeed almost the sole reason, that the official unemployment rate has been, quote, cut in half, as the president said, is because millions and millions of Americans have left the workforce, because the hope of the American worker has crashed, and it's now reached the same low levels as it did during the Carter years. Now, the president did also tell these high school students that to create a better, stronger economy, we, quote, have to be honest about what our real economic challenges are, unquote. Well, here I agree with him. So let's start with an honest assessment made recently by former President Clinton. Here's what he said about the Obama economy. Quote, millions and millions and millions and millions of people look at the pretty picture of America President Obama has painted, and they cannot find themselves in it to save their lives, unquote. That's former Democratic President Bill Clinton talking about the loss of hope over the last 8 years. And he goes on, President Clinton recently said, quote, "The problem is 80% of the American people are still living on what they were living on the day before the 2008 financial crash. And about half the American people, after you adjust for inflation, are living on what they were living on the last day I, meaning President Clinton, was in office 15 years ago. So that's what's the matter," unquote. So that's President Clinton. He is talking honestly about this economy. That's what honesty looks like. Family incomes have declined during the Obama years. Wages have been stagnant. And the economic hope of the American worker has crashed to levels not seen since Jimmy Carter. So, Mr. President, I want to close with a few words for the American people as we get to the final months of the Obama administration. The president is going to make the claim, and some of his supporters, and maybe even Secretary Clinton, are going to make the claim that the unemployment rate during the Obama years went from 10.1% to 4.7%. They're going to talk about this. They're going to make people believe that somehow this is a great accomplishment. And while technically true, what Secretary Clinton's not going to do is actually unpack the numbers, is actually tell the whole truth. Because that unemployment rate decline is due primarily to the fact that so many American workers have simply quit looking for work. That's the full truth. So when you hear this great number, 10.1% unemployment all the way down to 4.7%, the real number is 9.7%. The real number is in this index. The real number is that the American workers' hope over the last 8 years has crashed. So when the president and the White House start to continue to tell us that everything is fine, that jobs are plentiful, that the unemployment rate has been slashed in half, that our economy is strong relative to other countries, it's really, really important to look at what they're really saying. We shouldn't believe that. And the vast majority of Americans don't believe it because they're hurting. They are hurting because this economy is hurting. Millions of Americans want to work but can't find a job. Millions of Americans have just quit looking for a job. And as the president says, we need to recognize that fact and to be honest about it. Only then can we do what is one of the most important jobs this Senate can do, which is grow our economy again and create real job opportunities for the millions of American workers who want to work but have been so discouraged that they've left the workforce. Mr. President, I yield the floor.